The Denver Broncos defense should be drastically better in 2024, but who will lead the team in sacks? We'll tell you why we think Baron Browning might be the lead sack getter for the team this upcoming season on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day. Every single day, whether you listen to us wherever you get your podcast or if you watch us on YouTube. Make sure you do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long, regarding the Denver Broncos for the best objective coverage, analysis, and more here on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, look, my friend, we're going through predicting the Denver Broncos defensive statistical output for this upcoming season. We'll look at sacks, we'll look at interceptions or takeaways, and maybe even tackles for a loss here. But I think we should really start things off on today's show with the Broncos edge rusher group and even the defensive line, like really the front seven. Sacks are an imperative metric in today's NFL, especially when you talk about stopping drives by the offense. Like, you can come up with a big sack on third down and all of a sudden it can shift the entire momentum of a game. The Broncos have had a step in the right direction, I'd say, in the sack department from 2023, but they haven't had a double-digit sack leader since 2018. They have not had a single player hit that, which is crazy to think about. It's a little bit of a drought here, but can they get there this upcoming season? If all these players play the anticipated every game of the season, I think that there's a possibility Baron Browning could be that guy here for the Broncos this season, Sayre.
I really think he can as well. I love Baron Browning, what he brings to the table. If he can stay healthy, I mean, he could easily eclipse 10 sacks. We saw him get, 4.5 sacks last year in the 10 games that he played. And so, man, a guy who just recently, within the last couple of years, transitioned to that edge position. The sky's the limit in terms of production. And maybe in that contract year, Cody, I mean, he could put it all together and get some big time cash in the 2025 offseason. But just to quickly touch on what you just noted, that the Broncos haven't had anyone with double-digit sacks since 2018. Is that not one of the craziest stats about this team? I mean, I know things have been bad, but remember, 2018 was the year the Broncos drafted Bradley Chubb, 5th overall. They had Von Miller, who was just in the second or third year of his big money contract after Super Bowl 50. They still had Shaquille Barrett at that time on the roster, as well as a number of other really good interior defensive linemen that have come through in that time frame. I mean, the way that the team invested off the edge, and since then, I mean, you signed Randy Gregory to the big money free agent contract. The fact that there's been no double-digit sack guy on this defensive front is pretty alarming. And I know that people say all the time, and it's very true, sacks aren't the only metric for pass rush productivity, and we understand that, but sacks are one of the biggest ways that you can change a game. It's the way the Broncos won Super Bowl 50. It wasn't just quarterback hits and pressures. If Von Miller doesn't take the ball away from Cam Newton in Super Bowl 50, we don't know how that game goes, right? I mean, they needed that defensive touchdown to get things going. And so I'm not saying every year your defense is going to have to score points for your offense, things like that. But sacks are so big when it comes to creating takeaways, killing drives, creating opportunities for your offense. It is so important. And so I think when you talk about Baron Browning potentially leading this team, Cody, to me, that is the guy that I see really being the breakout player this year. I know we've talked about it in the past. I'm saying if we set the over-under, if he played 17 games last year, he would have had roughly 8 sacks given his sacks per game at 4.5 sacks in 10 games. I'm saying over. I'm smashing over on the 8 sacks for Baron Browning in 2024.
I like that. I'm taking the over as well. I think Baron will have 11 sacks this upcoming season if he can stay fully healthy. He's the anticipated starter there alongside Jonathon Cooper, which, I mean, for example, I think that we should even give our little projection throw out there. And look, Broncos fans, throw it out as well. Like, just a fun exercise of the offseason. I think if Baron Browning stays fully healthy, 11 and a half sacks for him this upcoming season. Where are you at with Baron? And then we'll get to Jonathon Cooper, who led the team in sacks last year for Denver.
Yeah, I love Nick Bonitto's potential this year, Cody, and I think that he is another guy. I think maybe the Broncos kind of overcorrect with recent history, right? Two guys getting double-digit sacks this season, I don't think is out of the realm of possibility for one primary reason: the defensive line that is going to be occupying blockers. You know how important that is from what we saw with the Super Bowl 50 team, Derek Wolfe, Malik Jackson, all of these other guys. To me, I see Nick Bonitto going over what he had last year, the 8 sacks. I'm saying he gets at least 10 in 2024.
Okay. I got Nick coming up with 9 in 2024. I think that when you look at Denver's balance, the rotational reps as well, I think you're going to have opportunities for everybody to eat. And this is saving some room as well for the defensive linemen. In terms of Jonathon Cooper, who led the team last year, I think he's going to probably get maybe 6.5, 7, which, look, it's not as many as he had last year, but I think Jonathon Cooper is going to have better production. I think the Broncos' production on the defensive line is going to spread out, right? Kind of like we talked about in yesterday's episode. If we don't see Courtland Sutton hauling in 10 touchdown catches next year, it's because there's more mouths to feed. There's other guys that'll probably be catching passes, catching touchdowns from whoever the starting quarterback's going to be. I think with the additions on the defensive line, like you mentioned, you're going to see that productivity spread out a little bit more balance versus it just being two guys really leading the way like Bonitto did and Cooper did last season. I like that. But let's dive into maybe another element here, right? We talked about the edge rushers. Jonah Ellis, rookie guy. I have him kind of deemed as really the cleanup guy for the Broncos this year. Not the guy I think is going to go out there and, in certain situations dominate. But I think that pressure will get to certain quarterbacks to where a quarterback's going to scramble around the pocket. Jonah Ellis is going to be there to clean it up. I got the Broncos rookie. I'm going to set his over under at 3.5. I think he's going to hit 4 this upcoming season.
I like that number. I think that would be really nice to see because the Broncos haven't had a ton of just tremendous production off the edge from their, the guys they've drafted in recent years. It hasn't been just immediately, even the guys coming in like Nick Bonitto, who was one of the best in terms of pass rush productivity at the college level. And he came in and struggled off the edge to get to the quarterback. So even the best guys at the college level will come in and have struggles. I love the over under of 3.5. I was going to say over under 4.5 because, I'm a little greedy there. But I like that. I think let's say 4 or 5 sacks this year from Jonah Ellis would be really nice, especially if everybody stays healthy. That's a great number. If he has to play a lot, that's going to change that number, obviously. But I think that over under at 3.5, 4.5, somewhere in there seems really reasonable for him.
Well, let's touch on the Broncos defensive ends here real quick. Obviously, Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers. I look at where they're at in terms of this edge rush group. If they can create interior penetration and pressure the way that they have historically, I'm not going to give them like, okay, this guy's going to get 7 or 8 sacks. I think a good baseline for these two players, probably 4 sacks over under each. It's all about impact and productivity there. It's harder, in my opinion, I feel like, Sayre, to get a sack at defensive end than it is to get it at edge rusher. I feel like you have more opportunities as an edge guy versus being a D end. I'm going to go with 4. I'm going to set the baseline for them over under on 4. I don't know, where they're going to end up. I think Zach Allen, I could see him getting 4.5. I could see John Franklin Myers potentially getting 4.5 as well. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to have impactful seasons. I think people are like, oh, 4.5, that's a low number. It's really hard in today's game, I think, to get sacks from the defensive end and even the defensive tackle standpoint to the rate in which you see edge rushers get overall. They don't make them like J.J. Watt anymore. Max Crosby is the only guy I think right now in the NFL who's probably fit in that bill there. Trey Hendrickson, potentially the Bengals. But that's where I'm at with the Broncos defensive linemen. And look, Broncos country, we want to hear from you to share your thoughts with us as well on the over-unders. How many sacks do you think Baron Browning, Nick Bonitto, Jonathon Cooper, Jonah Ellis, John Franklin Myers, Zach Allen, how many sacks do you think these guys are going to get collectively? Let us know if you're watching on YouTube, or you can message us on social media if you're listening wherever you get your podcast. But we're also going to dive deep into another element of the defense that's important: interceptions, takeaways. Which Broncos defender will lead the team in interceptions in 2024? We'll tell you who we think will on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos country, today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And look, I love sports, and I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But obviously, this is a time period of the year where there's a buildup without sports. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games that are going on, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to, or probably how you want them to as well. But FanDuel, they let me keep the sports going whenever I want, and all I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And right now is the perfect time to get in on NFL futures bets that are going on inside the FanDuel Sportsbook app, where you can look at specific things, widespread NFL, like who you think will win the MVP this year, who you think will win the Super Bowl. Or if you want to get into some Broncos specials, you can find player props on Bo Nix, Javonte Williams, Cortland Sutton, and others. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
With Justin Simmons gone, the Denver Broncos are going to have a new team leader in interceptions in 2024. We're going to break down who that could be on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, free and available everywhere that you listen to podcasts. And you know what? If you haven't already, hit subscribe on your podcast platform so you get us, thrown into your feed every now and again. And also go over to YouTube and hit subscribe there if you haven't already. Jump in the comment section, smash the like button, do all those things to get Locked On Broncos not only up in your algorithm, but for other Denver Broncos fans as well who want the latest news, content, and coverage. And by the way, if you want the latest news, content, and coverage, you need to check out Locked On Sports Today, bringing you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Justin Simmons is gone. That means the Denver Broncos are going to have a new team leader in interceptions in 2024. Justin has obviously been the best in the NFL since 2016 when he came into the league. Nobody has more interceptions than his 30 since 2016. So naturally, he's been leading the team in this category for a long time. And the Broncos now have, I guess you could say, it's not just a huge hole to fill in terms of his, leadership, his off-field, his, whatever you want to say, but on-field production. Like, this is a big question mark now, Cody, with his interceptions going away. Somebody's got to create these takeaways, and it's not a small deal that Justin is gone. Let's start with the best player on the team, Pat Surtain II. What do you see as maybe his over-under? I know he only had one interception last year. What do you see as his over-under this year in terms of INTs, and where do you see him ultimately landing?
Well, I think our baseline for him would probably be 3, right? I mean, in a perfect world, like in a Champ Bailey situation, we'd say, all right, let's see if he can get 6 this upcoming season. I think the challenge, though, is you're not really going to see, and I think this will be a big element of it. I still don't think that you're going to see teams throw at Pat a lot. I think they're going to try to test him every now and again, and you're going to see him come up with a takeaway or a knockaway. He's one of the best cornerbacks in the game, but because he's one of the best cornerbacks in the game, I don't think he's going to see as many targets, right? So 3, I think, is a great place to start for him. And look, you're talking about spreading interception production out, not just amongst your secondary, but your linebackers. Your maybe tip passes to the defensive line, that you could see a defensive lineman, come up with an interception as well. I mean, you're going to have a multitude of guys rotating in. It's not just going to be 11 players on defense. You're going to see probably 15, 16, 17 different guys having imperative roles rotationally here for Denver this upcoming season. So part of me is wondering, like, how do you balance this out? I mean, you can't replace a guy like Justin Simmons. I think the biggest question you're going to see is, well, who steps in? Is it going to be a safety that's going to lead the way for the Broncos? Well, if that's the case there, I think that PJ Locke's probably the prime candidate to be a takeaway producer here, whether that's interceptions, forced fumbles, fumble recoveries, because he's going to blitz. He's going to try to sack the quarterback on several occasions as well. But PJ's got an elevated role. I think between Pat and PJ, I think the leading interception artist on the team will be between one of those two guys. How do you feel about that? What are your thoughts on the subject matter? And, maybe is there another guy that maybe you have your eyes on as well?
Well, let's touch on Pat Surtain really quickly here, because you look over the course of his first 3 NFL seasons, 96 targets as a rookie, 77 in his second season, which was his all-pro year, and then 91 targets last season. He has a career total of 7 interceptions. Okay, that's a lot of targets coming his direction, and the interception numbers have gone down. Now, 91 targets and 1 interception this past year. I think for Pat Surtain's, standard that we've set for him in terms of what we perceive him to be as a lockdown corner, he's going to want to turn up the heat a little bit on attacking the football in the air. 1 interception and 91 target. If quarterbacks are throwing the ball at him 91 times, he better be making them pay more than once. I know he breaks up a lot of passes. I know that he's never allowed a completion percentage at 60% or above. It's all under 60%. So he is dominant at his position. I'm being overly critical of a superstar player here and saying, hey, those Champ Bailey comparisons, you remember Champ Bailey had 10 interceptions in a season. I'm not saying Pat's got to do that to create a legacy. What I am saying, though, is he's got to turn up the heat in terms of taking the ball away, especially now with Justin Simmons out of the picture. So that pressure doesn't just fall on PJ Locke and Brandon Jones. It falls on Pat Surtain, who we've talked about. The versatility that Jim Leonard is preaching in that secondary could end up being a big factor in him creating more takeaways. I think we need to see a career high from PS2 this season in interceptions, and his current career high is 4. So we've got to see him go above that, in my opinion. Now, when you talk about somebody else that could potentially lead the team, a guy we've talked about a lot on this show is Jaquan McMillan, who was a football magnet last year and has been dating back to his days of college. I mean, we've talked about it. 8 interceptions his final year at East Carolina, an All-American season. Got an interception in the first opportunity that he had in the NFL against Mike Williams, right? And made a great play on the ball. Came in, completely changed the course of the Denver Broncos defense last year by creating takeaways, forced fumbles, fumble recoveries, interceptions. He did it all. He's the one guy that I could see, Cody, potentially leading the team overall in takeaways, even if he doesn't lead the team in interceptions.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of Denver's cornerback, including Patrick Surtain, kind of going back to that conversation, last year, the defensive scheme was very frustrating to watch. I mean, a lot of those throws that you're mentioning that Pat has given up in terms of 91 targets, well, it's because they're throwing it short. It's the underneath stuff. It's because Pat Surtain is being told to play on 3rd and 3. He's being told to play 7 yards off the ball. It's like the scheme didn't match up to what the players could do well. I think from what I've at least seen in OTAs in the offseason program, that should be different this year. That's the hope, right? And I think you'll have a multitude of guys step up. I like what you brought up about Jaquan McMillan. The fact that he's playing a little bit more on the outside, that increases more opportunities. The fact he was able to produce takeaways at the rate he did last season inside the slot and the nickel, which is one of the hardest positions to play in all of football in today's game, is impressive. Now you put him on the outside where he can have a little bit more of an opportunity to go make more plays on the football, have opportunities to intercept the ball a little bit more. I'm excited about that. The safety position, Brandon Jones, obviously another addition. Caden Stearns, as we know, as when healthy, is a proven ball hawk. He's been able to generate interceptions and takeaways. There are a lot of questions about this team, especially in the secondary, in terms of how you replace a guy like Justin Simmons. I think, health considered, I think the Broncos have probably the best depth in the secondary now than they've had in the last several years. And that's all on paper right now. Look, obviously that has to be proven on the field in the regular season. Once we figure out what the final 53-man roster is going to look like, I think Denver will be in a better position from a secondary standpoint, even though there are going to be some questions about replacing the impact of a guy like Justin Simmons, which, to be honest with you, don't think you can do that. I think you have to spread that type of production amongst a group of players versus him, because he was one of the smartest guys on the field and he understood route concepts. He understood formation. Not saying these other guys don't, but the way he did it was at an elite level that has him obviously recognized by a lot of people. Very, very curious to see who steps up in terms of interceptions for the Broncos this upcoming season. And Broncos Country, we want to know your thoughts. Who do you think will lead the Broncos in interceptions here in 2024? Make sure you drop it in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening wherever you get your podcast, you want to get involved in the conversation, you can always get us on social media at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger. But one important metric, probably one of the more underrated ones when we talk about defensive production outside of tackles, is tackles for a loss. They have an impact on the course of a game, on a drive at any given moment. Who will lead the Broncos in TFLs this upcoming season? We'll tell you why. It could be a multitude of defenders on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, real quick, Broncos Country. Thank you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. You can get us for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you subscribe or follow if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out on objective Broncos news, content coverage, analysis, and more. We have a lot of stuff coming your way, including our positional previews of every position on offense and defense for training camp. We'll look at the key storylines with the biggest name player at the position. We'll look at the depth and what each player brings to the table, and we'll share our thoughts as to who at those positions we'll think will make the active roster. That all begins next week here on the show. But as we continue on, a little bit of a fun exercise here on today's episode of the show, who will lead the Broncos in TFLs? I mean, Sayre, we talk so much about the important metrics like interceptions and sacks, right? But I think we can look at some underlying stats and impacts that probably go under the radar. I think quarterback hurries, pressures are very big in terms of pass rush. I think when you talk about passes defensed, I think that's an important metric. But when it comes to outside of just tackles, I think tackles for a loss are an important metric here defensively, because it means that you're disrupting something with the flow of the offense. You're making offenses go backwards in a sense. It's not necessarily a sack, but it's like, hey, it's a run or it's a pass at the line of scrimmage and they're losing yards. You're doing something well defensively. And the Broncos had a multitude of players last year that had an impact in overall tackles for a loss behind the scrimmage. Now, just to recap, in 2023, Nick Bonitto led the team with 13 TFLs. Tackles for a loss behind the line of scrimmage last year. Second to him, you had a tie for second between Jonathon Cooper, who led the team in sacks. Zach Allen had 8 TFLs. And then you had a cornerback coming in third, essentially, Jaquan McMillan, with 7 tackles for a loss. And that's impressive considering he didn't start all year for the Broncos. He appeared in a lot of games, but he got some starts later on, and he played a big-time role there in terms of coming up and making plays, which led to teams having a longer field to convert from.
Yeah, and the Broncos need more production here in 2024. I mean, there's no question about it. Vance Joseph talked at the end of mandatory minicamp. He said, I mean, straight up, the problem last year wasn't gap fits, which I think a lot of times we were wondering as we were watching the tape after Broncos are getting gashed week in and week out defensively. We're wondering, like, all right, who's to blame here? Is it the talent level? Are they not fitting in their gaps? Are they just missing tackles? The problem last year, according to Vance Joseph, was not gap integrity, but missed tackles. And I think a lot of missed opportunities for tackles for loss, running backs that were escaping in the backfield from initial contact and then creating 3-4 yards downfield. It was so frustrating to watch because the Broncos would have guys, I mean, fish in a barrel situations, and they would just let them go. And it was really, it stunk to have to watch, honestly, over the course of this. It cost them a few games. No, I mean, certainly against the Miami Dolphins, a missed tackle clinic in that game. So
Detroit,
when you talk, Detroit game was abysmal, and it's something the team knew they had to upgrade, and so they did just that this offseason by upgrading obviously the defensive line, because those guys are going to make plays behind the line of scrimmage. I think, to me, if I have to peg who's going to lead this team this year, I know we kind of said in the first segment that he could take a step back in terms of sacks. I feel like Jonathon Cooper is the guy that I feel like is going to lead the Denver Broncos in tackles for loss in the 2024 season. Now, last year, Cooper had 8 tackles for loss. As you mentioned, second on the team in that category. I feel like this is an area that he's going to really take a step forward. If his sack numbers go down, I think not necessarily that he's going to intentionally compensate for this, but I think we're going to see a little bit of compensation in terms of double-digit TFLs from Jonathon Cooper to have him lead the way in 2024.
I mean, I think a multitude of those 3 guys, like with how impressive Nick Bonitto was. Like, Nick started a few games for Denver last year, but primarily once Baron Browning came back, he went back to the rotational role. The fact that he still led the team with 13 TFLs is impressive. I think between Baron Browning, Jonathon Cooper, and obviously Nick Bonitto, I think at the edge rusher position, any of those 3 guys will lead the team in TFLs. I'm going to go here. I'm going to talk about John Franklin Myers a little bit. Like, obviously, Zach Allen, was able to create penetration last year, have some TFLs in the backfield, 8 to be exact. I think that he and John Franklin Myers and Zach Allen together, I think they can wreak havoc. Now, I think a big part of it as well, like we even heard Zach Allen talk about it, saying that the Broncos defensive line, the mentality now is more attacking. The defensive line's mentality is to attack more so than it was to read and react. And that's under Jamar Cain's direction now as the new defensive line coach, with Marcus Dixon parting ways. I think Zach Allen said in that exact interview that last year was a little bit more of read and react versus just go attack and trust that if you're going to stunt inside the A gap, you have somebody coming in to fill the B gap, and you're not necessarily worried about that. It's guys doing their job. I'm very curious to see with the addition of Franklin Myers, who, I mean, when you look at him on the field, Sayre, massive. It could be the biggest move the Broncos made in the entire offseason when it's all said and done. I think we'll probably revisit that probably week 12, week 13 here of the NFL season. You look at that, and I think the addition on the interior and the trenches of guys like Malcolm Roach, you add in Angelo Blackson to the mix. I think that Denver's going to have more stout trench play this upcoming season, which will lead, I think, to more TFLs from your edge rushers. And I also think you can see some more backfield penetration from guys like Franklin Myers and Zach Allen this upcoming season.
You know who could be a sneaky name? I didn't even think to list him on our script, but I wonder if Jonas Griffith ends up starting. He's the type of guy who, with his body type, his athleticism, the ability that we've seen from him attacking the line of scrimmage, blitzing, the instincts, because that does matter as well. When you're trying to make a play behind the line of scrimmage, you have to react quickly and you have to be able to finish the play in the backfield. I feel like Jonas Griffith, if he ends up starting in 2024, he could be a sneaky candidate to make a lot of plays behind the line of scrimmage because he's a 250-pound off-ball linebacker. I mean, he's a big dude who runs really fast. He's got long arms, and he's physical, man. He is so physical. So I feel like he's a sneaky candidate. Not to sell Alex Singleton. I know we haven't really got a chance to talk about Singleton in this episode much.
He'll lead the team in tackles this year.
Yeah, we skipped the tackle category just for him. Like, we don't even need to talk about who's going to lead the team in tackles. The guy averages 20 tackles a game or whatever. So I think, that's the situation for Alex, is like, by way of him leading the team in tackles, he could very well be the team's leader in tackles for loss as well, just because of just by virtue of the fact that he's going to have the most tackles on the team. So why not the most tackles for loss, right? So I could see that being the case, especially if the Broncos deploy him more. We saw Josie Jewell blitz a lot last year. Singleton blitzed quite a bit as well. I wonder how much more of that responsibility will fall on Singleton in 2024, having him attack the line of scrimmage.
Well, I like that you mentioned Jonas Griffith, because if he does end up being the starter, I agree with you. I mean, the dude has a Terminator body type. Like, he looks like a freak of nature, and he's tall, and I think that's going to give him some credence. But if the defensive line is going to attack certain areas, I mean, ideally, when you're talking about the defensive end position, unless you're having like a tackle, like a tackle end twist, more than likely, if a defensive end is crashing inside, you're either going to have your outside linebacker blitzing in, or you're going to have a nickel guy blitzing, or you're going to have the inside linebacker filling the other gap and coming free. Like, the offensive line will have to choose one or the other. And Jonas is a guy who's so athletic, so big. I mean, he is a true piss missile, if we're using that term here to bring it back on the show. I could definitely see that. That might be the most underrated pick there, Sayre. So hats off to you. I like that. I think that could be something we do see happen here for the Broncos this upcoming season. But look, Broncos Country, as you know, this is a fun exercise as we get ready to build up for the start of training camp. Beginning next week, our position previews will commence. And for all you everyday listeners here in Broncos Country, you want to know what we're going to talk about on tomorrow's episode of the show? Which potential duos on offense and defense could emerge to play off of each other here in 2024? We'll break that down and much more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. We'll see you then.